All right, welcome back, you guys. Here we are with Unit 4.2, Evolution and Natural Selection. So we're continuing right along with Section 3, which is on natural selection. So as a review, in Part 1, we talked about what evolution is, how it's change over time that leads to new species. We talked about Darwin's journey, how he was the one who traveled on the HMS Beagle collecting data around South America and the Galapagos Islands, and published a book on the origin of species that outlined his 5 key observations and led to the theory of evolution. We also talked about the evidence for evolution, such as looking through and analyzing the fossil records and doing comparisons. We also talked about homologous structures in different organisms, like how the bones in our arm develop the same way as the bones in a bat's wing. We also talked about vestigial structures, structures that seem to be evolutionary leftovers that don't have a function today, but probably had a function in an ancestor, such as the femur. There's a little bit of a femur left over in whales, even though they don't have hind legs anymore. And we also talked about DNA evidence, how we can use gel electrophoresis to compare the DNA between different species and look to see how much DNA they have in common, because the more DNA they have in common, the more closely related they are. So now let's move on with part 3, which is natural selection. We kind of already started talking about this a little bit already in terms of Darwin's observations, but we're going to go into a little more detail now. So let's get going. All right, so what is the definition of natural selection? Well, it is the mechanism by which individuals that have inherited beneficial adaptation show differential reproductive success. In other words, those with the better adaptations are more likely to survive and have offspring. So they are what it's saying is that the organisms that are better suited to their environment are more likely to survive and thrive. Thrive meaning have more offspring. So they're going to live longer. Since they live longer, they're going to have more offspring. The offspring are going to have those same traits that made their parents successful. And that means they're going to live longer and have more babies. So if we look at this picture below, they're both cheetahs. And just like us, are all humans completely 100% identical? No, we come in different heights, different colors, different builds. Some people have longer arms than others. So that's kind of what we're talking about, these small variations within individuals of one species. So here we have 2 cheetahs, and they have a slight variation. One's leg is a little bit longer than the others. So what they notice, or what could have happened, is a longer leg may allow the cheetah to run faster, but because it's longer, it puts more muscle strain on the bone, and it could lead to increased risk of breaking the leg. So even though it can run faster, it's also more likely to get hurt to the point where it will die. Now, I know to us, a broken leg doesn't seem like a big deal. You know, we go to the doctor, we get a cast, and, several weeks later, it's all good. But for a cheetah, it's a different story. If their leg is broken, they can no longer run. They probably can't even walk that well. And if they can't walk or run, they can't catch prey, which means they will starve. Or a hyena or a lion could view them as easy prey and take them down and they get eaten themselves. So the ones that live longer are the ones on the left, with the optimal length. The ones with the longer leg tend to die sooner. So since the ones on the left live longer, they can have more cubs. So each year, maybe they have 2-3 cubs. Well, that's each year. So over time, since they're living longer, they're going to have a lot more offspring than the ones on the right. As a result, their cubs, the ones with the slightly shorter leg are more numerous, and they're going to live longer than the cubs that are born to ones with longer legs, which means they're going to have their own cubs. And over many, many generations, we start seeing a change in the population where more and more individuals, each generation, more and more are born with the slightly shorter leg, and less are being born with the longer leg simply because they're not living as long, so they can't have as many cubs, which means there's fewer cubs with that trait in the next generation. So then over time, over many generations, eventually there will be no more cubs with the longer legs. So now the whole population has the trait of the slightly shorter leg, the optimal leg length. So that's what we're talking about in terms of natural selection. Survival of the fittest. So I know we've used these examples before, but we're still going to keep talking about them. A lot of times when we talk about survival of the fittest, people think it means survival of the strongest, but that's not it. It depends on the organism's fitness. Again, not looking at strength. It's looking at whether or not it is able to successfully survive and reproduce. So can it survive and thrive? And those with the best adaptations are the ones with the highest fitness, meaning that they have the better adaptations, the better traits that allow them to survive longer and also have more offspring as they survive longer. So they pass on those traits to their offspring. As a result, the offspring also have those traits and are also better able to survive and thrive. We've talked about the shark. So I know we've talked about this in previous sections, but I'm really trying to get the example and the idea down. So sharks, they have an incredibly high fitness for their environment. Now, if you put them in a different environment, their fitness goes down because the adaptations are what allow an organism to survive and thrive in their environment. Sharks have high fitness, have great adaptations for their environment. They can breathe water or breathe oxygen through their gills. They have a very, very sleek, smooth design, very streamlined to prevent or reduce, I should say, drag in the water. They have very, very muscular build. They have a lot of muscles that allow them to swim quickly and give them a lot of power. They also have these specialized sensory organs in the snout and goes down what we call the lateral line. And what these are, it's like a sixth sense that allows them to detect the electrical biorhythms. So the small electrical impulses given off by a living thing. Here you can see the anatomy of a shark. They actually do have a little bit of hearing as well, so they can hear different tones and all that through the water, which help them kind of hunt. Their eyes, again, they can see. Mouth and nose for taste and smell. You know, they can detect blood up to several miles away. That's just a little bit of blood. They have very sensitive skin, sensitive touch and temperature. Also, they have on the surface of their skin these things called, I think, denticles. So it's kind of like scales, but they're teeth-like. So that's why it feels rough if you go with the grain. But if you go against the grain, then you can actually cut yourself because they're pretty sharp little things. And then the lateral line, which stems from the nose, which is where the ampulla of Lorenzini is located. That's what senses the electrical biorhythms. And then the lateral line extends from that all the way down. It can kind of help sense those as well, and also helps to detect changes in the pressure of the water around it. So very, very scary. Over time, the great white shark hasn't really needed to change its adaptations because it's already been very, very highly well suited to its environment. In fact, the only thing that's changed from its common ancestor is its size. The megalodon was many times larger than the great white shark of today. But of course, way, way back then, there were much larger organisms in the ocean, and it had an abundant large prey to choose from. As the larger sea organisms died off, it didn't have as much prey to feed on. So those that were smaller were able to eat enough to survive, and the larger ones, the megs, actually eventually died out. But apart from size, they really haven't changed because they are so highly successful in their environment. Here's another example, giraffes. So giraffes, we know today, have long necks, but it's believed based on fossils that, way, way back, their ancestor didn't have as long of necks. But what was likely the case, why we see the long necks, is exactly what we talked about with the cheetah picture, that those with the longer necks were able to reach higher food sources. So there was less competition. They didn't have to compete with the zebras and the gazelles and the wildebeest and the rhinos or anything like that for food, because none of those organisms could reach the top leaves. So those with the longer necks had less competition for food, and those with the shorter necks had more competition. Well, since the ones with the longer necks had less competition, they lived longer without starving, so they were able to survive. Those with the shorter necks encountered more competition, so they were more likely to starve to death. As a result, over many, many generations, the long-necked giraffes, they survived longer, they survived and had children, offspring each year. So the population started to shift. Instead of being like 50-50, you start having higher percentages of the long neck ones and smaller percentages of the small neck ones. And then over time, you only had long neck giraffes, and all of the short ones were starved and gone, and only the long neck ones survive. So this is also an example of, it's also an example with moths. Now here we see that the moths, they lay eggs, the eggs develop into the caterpillars, and the caterpillars will develop into the moths. Now the moths actually come in two variations, white and dark. Now if you look at this picture, it's kind of easy to see that, yeah, we can tell where the dark ones are, and they weren't as common, but the lighter ones were very easy to see against the darker wood of the tree. So since the whiter ones were very easy to see, the birds were more likely to go after those. Since the birds were more likely to go after those, the darker ones lived longer. They had more eggs and caterpillars that would also carry the genes for the darker colors. And over time, the population changed so that more and more were being born with the darker colors and fewer were being born with the lighter colors. All right. So misconceptions. First, let's talk about what a misconception is. The definition of the term misconception is a view or opinion that is incorrect because it is based on faulty thinking or understanding. So a misconception is when you think something is correct, but it's actually not, and it's either based, the reason why it's incorrect is because you don't really understand the concept, so you have some of the facts mixed up, or just because your thought patterns are, well, it's right because I say it. It's not based on fact, in other words. So misconception of natural selection number one. It does not mean an individual adapts to the environment. That is not true at all. Individuals do not adapt to the environment. We're talking about changes in populations. So what that means is these small changes will build up over time and over the generations, and that will lead to adaptations and changes in the population. So like we saw with the moths, most of them were born with the whiter wings and few of them were born with the variation of the darker wings. Well, we're not saying that one of the ones with the lighter wings suddenly magically changed into a darker wing moth. That's not what we're saying at all. We're saying there's two variations within the population. One is more common than the other. But over time, the birds can see one of the variations. They can see the whiter moths very easily and a lot more easily than the darker moths. So they eat those more. Like, hey, we can see them, let's eat them. And over time, the darker moths aren't being eaten as much, so because they have better camouflage, so they live longer, which means each year they're going to lay more eggs. So they're going to lay eggs year 1, year 2, however long they'll last. But they're going to lay more eggs, and those eggs will give rise to moths with the same camouflage, the same genes, the same traits as their parents. So over time, we're starting to see more and more of the darker moths and fewer of the white moths, because the white moths are getting eaten before they have a chance to lay eggs. As a result, we see a shift in the population from mostly white moths with a variation of dark kind of splattered in to mostly dark moths with a few variations of white mixed in. So here's another example. We have these, I don't know, beetles, and out of the 6, 2 of them, see those little dots? They have a gene for pesticide resistance. So they're on a crop, the farmer sprays the crop with a pesticide, and it's going to kill 4 out of 6, so 2/3 of the population. Only the ones that have the gene that makes them resistant to the poison of the pesticide survive. They survive, they reproduce. We now have generations where the majority have the gene for pesticide resistance. So that's what we're talking about. Number 2, misconception. Natural selection is not constant. And the reason why we say it's not constant is because environments change. The environments that we see in today, the ecosystems we see today, are not the same environments of the ones, 65 million years, 100 million years ago. They're vastly different. And as the environment changes, so would the need for different traits. So let's go back to the moths for a moment. How that occurred is it was during the Industrial Revolution of England, I believe. I know it was in Europe. And the trees naturally had a lighter bark on them. So as the lighter bark was more prominent, the lighter moths were the ones that survived longer, had more eggs and caterpillars, and led to an increase in the lighter coloration variant. And because the trees were lighter in color, the darker moths were more easily seen, and thus they were the ones that were eaten by the birds. So over generations, you have more of the lighter moths and fewer of the darker moths. But then during the Industrial Revolution, the factories were putting out a lot more smoke and dust and ash into the air, and that actually coated the trees and made their bark darker because of the extra soot on them. Well, now that the trees were darker, see, a change in the environment, a change in the ecosystem. Now that the trees were darker, the darker moths were able to camouflage better, and the lighter moths, which were very successful previously, were no longer successful. They were more easily seen on the darker trees, which meant they were more easily to be eaten, which means the darker moths survived better. They were better adapted to this change. So those better adapted to the new conditions now have the better fitness. And this is exactly what we were talking about. In England before, the lichen was what gave the tree its lighter color. So this is a tree trunk, and there's actually 2 moths here. We can very easily see one of the moths. And guess what? So could the birds. So the birds are going to go after this moth right here. They're not going to go after the other moth. Want to know where the other moth is? Right here, blending in nicely. Look at that camouflage. It blends in super well. So it was rarely eaten. It had high fitness for this type of environment. But then after the Industrial Revolution came and the air pollution, a lot of the lichens were killed. They died. They couldn't survive on the trees anymore. And soot covered the trees. And this is what the trees look like after that. Well, it's the same species of moths, but now we see a change in the population. Now we see a change in conditions. The lighter moth is now much easier to see. So the birds are going to go after that one, as opposed to the darker moth, which now has the better adaptations. So since they're harder to see, they're going to survive longer. They're going to have more eggs. The lighter one, which was very abundant before, is now easily seen. It is going to become easy prey. So they're not going to survive as long and not going to have as many eggs. Thus, the population changed so that over time, most of the population were now the darker variety. All right, so artificial selection is kind of the opposite. It's similar to natural selection, but it's not natural. For instance, the term artificial kind of means fake, not real, not natural. So what is artificial selection? It is the process of changing species by breeding it for certain traits. So what this means is that we are choosing the individuals with traits we like, and we're only going to breed those. So it doesn't occur in nature. There's some kind of purposeful force behind it, such as us. We can also call this selective breeding. So we selectively breed organisms with desired traits in order to increase those traits. So it's not necessarily because those traits help an organism to survive better. We breed for those traits because they help us in some way. Corn, for instance. So this was the ancient corn, the ancestor of corn. It does not look like this. We see it more so like this. And the reason for that being, this one provides more of the pollen to make the corn. And this, the female variety, is what we eat. And the reason why we went from this to this is because this one, the modern one, provides us with more food sources. So we can actually eat it. We can eat it ourselves. We can provide it to livestock for food. But this is more edible, and there's a lot more kernels, as you can see, than there are here. So what we would do is, over time, we would look for, as we're growing the corn, maybe there's the male and female kind of separate off. And we notice that, hey, look, there's extra kernels on this one. So we're going to take the one with extra kernels, and we're just going to grow that one, not the one with fewer kernels. And then once we take care of that, we look for, again, each harvest, we look for the ones that produce the most kernels. We take those and we only plant those. So that over time, we get more and more kernels. Another example, cows. There are different breeds of cows. And what we did was, for the dairy industry, we only bred those cows that produce a lot of milk. So hey, this one produced a lot of milk, we're going to breed this one. This one didn't produce quite as much milk, so we're not going to breed that. And the reason why is because if they have the trait to produce more milk, then we breed them, their offspring are likely to have that trait as well. So over time, we have the cows that we see today. Most of the cows that we have on farms would not do very well in the wild at all. They're slow, they're large, and they're not always that muscular. They can't really defend themselves, which is why sometimes wild predators find them as easy prey. Because we bred them to be convenient for us. So we didn't select these traits for the cow to make it a better organism. We selected it for us so that it provides us with more food, more milk, etc. Dogs are also another great example. We've selectively bred for the traits of all the dogs for today. All dogs are one species. They are one species, yet look the variety. You have little tiny Chihuahuas, big old Great Danes. And they all came from a common ancestor with wolves. But over time, as we've domesticated them, and just like with us, there were variations in the dogs. We picked those with certain mutations, certain traits that we liked, that we found beneficial to us, and we only bred those. For instance, dachshunds, little hot wiener dogs like this guy right here in the middle of the picture. They were specifically bred to have those short legs. So over time, the humans would only breed the pups with short legs, and eventually it's how we got dachshunds today. And the reason why we wanted them with such short legs relative to their body size is because they can go into badger holes and get the badgers. So they were used for hunting and sporting. All right, so now the additional resources. Dun, 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 dun. We do have a video by me in my science in pajamas on natural selection. I show you guys some different examples of how it would go, as you kind of see from the thumbnail. So it might help a little bit, so I would definitely recommend you checking it out. There we go. And then here are some other videos that I think are good ones. There's a 2-minute classroom one, which discusses what is evolutionary fitness. Good example or explanation of fitness. The Amoeba Sisters, not quite sure why that thumbnail isn't showing up, but I'll make sure that it's there. But they have a great video on natural selection. Don't worry, it will be there when I post the link. A group called Primer, which does a great job of simulating natural selection. So remember how we talked about the changes in the population? They do a great job of simulating that. So it is a little longer of a video, but I'd recommend checking it out. You can always fast forward through different parts of it. And Khan Academy, Artificial Selection and Domestication. So it kind of looks at how this is different from natural selection. All right, so those are the natural resources, or sorry, additional resources. I will post the link for this Prezi, or for the Prezi in the description so that you can have access to the additional resources. Again, the natural selection Amoeba Sisters video will be there. I'm not quite sure why it didn't show up, but it will be there. And I definitely recommend checking out a few of those as part of this lesson to help with your own understanding. But in the meantime, if you have questions, feel free to hit me up in our Google Classroom or via email. And I hope this was helpful. I hope that it explained the material a bit better. If you have questions, definitely ask. That's what I'm here for. But in the meantime, take care of yourselves and stay healthy, stay safe, and I will talk to you guys later. All right. Bye, guys.